As much as people talk about bias in gaming these days, there's one particular bias I run into all the time on the channel and will continue to run into all the time on the channel, which is the bias towards new players. The idea that good game design is design that caters to players who've never played games before, or players with low legacy skill, or players who play casually and don't plan on playing beyond casually anytime soon. And I would never say that there shouldn't be casual games or casual game reviewers. Introductory material is an important aspect of the gaming market, but I think we've gotten to a point now where beginner games are no longer just an aspect of the market, they are now the majority of the market. And this makes sense from the developer side because the production costs of making mainstream games have become absurdly high. Developers no longer have the safety net of hardware limitations constricting costs like they did during the PS2 era. And so to offset the rising production costs, game developers can no longer just cater to their established hardcore audience like they were able to in the past, and instead must now be sure that every possible player out there, even non-players to some degree, is a potential customer. Just look at the shift in design of the Guilty Gear series over the years, or the shift in the types of games that Platinum makes now versus during their early days. The general downslide towards beginner-focused design is seen across pretty much all genres, and games that target expert players are generally niche except within the FPS genre, which is an important exception that I'll talk about at the end of the video. But outside of FPS, this need for mass sales has diluted game design in two particularly concerning ways. The first is simply the reduction of mechanical complexity and survival difficulty, and the second is the homogenization of gameplay mechanics and overall design. This is why every action game coming out these days is a Dark Souls clone, but easier. The drop in difficulty makes games more marketable to a mass audience, and the use of the Souls formula makes them immediately familiar to players who don't want to learn a brand new set of unique mechanics. The feeling I'm left with when I try to discuss this subject in my reviews is like being suffocated by a pillow of
apathy and indifference.
And I've noticed an interesting phenomenon when it comes to my fellow gaming YouTubers. This phenomenon is that if you go through the thousands of video essays from my peers in the gaming space, you'll notice there is a strong and persistent sentiment that game design these days has become stale and passive. We're all bored, and we all talk about how bored we are. However, when it comes down to the brass tacks of actual game reviews and actually evaluating individual games, wouldn't you know, this critical sentiment suddenly evaporates. We can talk about flawed design in the abstract until we are blue in the face, but no one really seems willing to actually apply these concepts when it matters. In game reviews, there is a cognitive dissonance where if you go by the content of reviews, gaming is wonderful and better than ever. But if you go by the content of general discussion and video essays, there is a really strong sentiment that games have become boring and need to return to being what they were in the good old days. A really fun experiment will be to see how people react to this video when I talk about flaws in game design abstractly, versus how people responded to my Stellar Blade video, where I talked about the same set of problems in game design specifically. I won't point out any individual channel, but it is funny to scroll through a lot of feeds these days and see positive review after positive review, and then every so often these channels release a random video about how they are dissatisfied with gaming generally. And maybe it's just me, but the vids talking about the decay of game design seem much more genuine than the constant softballing of whatever monthly masterpiece is being reviewed. There is a disconnect happening somewhere, we all feel it, but I don't think it has been properly addressed because as much as we complain about DLC and microtransactions, it's not like simply removing them is going to reverse the root of the problem. And part of the problem is this unspoken but powerful bias towards beginner game design. If you think about game critique as a valve, then this bias towards beginner design flows in only one direction, towards simplification. Among mainstream reviews, a game like Guilty Gear Strive that is well made but dumbed down will receive universal praise for its concessions towards beginners, because ironically, in the world of game critique, the critics are often beginners themselves. Catering to the critics is the same as catering to the masses. Beginners are critics and critics are beginners. In the world of art critique, this is an unholy fusion, because as annoying as gatekeeping snotty traditional critics are, they serve a very important function, which is to be some kind of alternative incentive beyond mass appeal. Now, I won't get into how art critique across many mediums these days fails this standard, but I think it is particularly ugly in gaming because supposed critics within the medium often don't even understand the artistic aspects of game design to begin with. They have no tools of analysis beyond sharing their feelings about the game's story and pushing for the game to cater towards their limited skill set. And wouldn't you know, what they want is for the game to be easier, less punishing, and more like the few handful of games they already know how to play. A really infamous example of this behavior that sticks out in my mind is the Polygon writer who outright refused to review Star Fox Zero due to its unique control scheme. And on one hand, I can understand if a player doesn't want to invest the time to develop the basic hand-eye coordination required to aim gyro controls, but for a supposed critic, this is a bit much. Star Fox Zero is a very easy game. It's fun, and I have a really old video defending it. I'm going to be a little more pretentious and, I guess intense than my usual content, but I feel like this situation is sort of warranted because I don't know how to beat around the bush with this issue. I feel like, honestly, a lot of the people who have reviewed the game aren't very good at rail shooters to begin with. They're not very good at arcade games to begin with. They don't understand hardcore games like shmups or rail shooters, those types of genres. They're just your average Nintendo fan who plays Mario games or whatever. And yeah, they're expecting just this easygoing time. And here comes Star Fox Zero pushing the player. But in no universe is it challenging to actually learn how to use the gyro controls. If you stop and think about how the system functions, this is a skill set that is completely missing from the critical landscape. If you actually go through and pay attention to what they write about gameplay mechanics, it is almost always a wiki-style description of the gameplay mechanics themselves that they're probably fed from the developer or from the press kit. It's never an analysis of how these systems actually function in practice and interact together. Time and time again, you will witness game critics become frustrated and dismissive of games with unique or challenging design, like Gungrave Gore, and instead always gravitate towards design that is derivative and familiar, just like beginner players. Game design is an iterative process, and I'm not one to dismiss the value of games building off and repeating popular mechanics, but the lack of value given to risky or bold design is a persistent problem, and it is a problem that attacks developers on all fronts. Commercially, they are punished for complex or challenging design simply because they scare away beginner players, and critically, if they aren't outright punished by game reviewers who tend to be gun-shy about criticizing complex games these days, cue IGN's flashbacks to God Hand, then they are at the very least extremely eager to welcome beginner concessions. This concept of punishment or gatekeeping is certainly the most controversial aspect of my game reviews, no doubt about it, but it's not like mainstream game reviewers all practice radical acceptance either. I honestly would respect game critics a lot more if they consistently decided to be completely open-minded and accepting towards whatever games they play, and then try their best to explain the strengths of the games to their viewers. But that's not what they do, and that's not really all that possible. What game critics do is tell the masses what they want to hear. They are quite adept at this practice, and the second they receive any pushback, they fold like lawn chairs. IGN's retracted review of God Hand is an example of this. It's not like retracting the review decades later somehow undoes the effects of the review at that time, but it does make IGN seem more in touch now, doesn't it? What I am saying is that gatekeeping is going to happen. It is a natural process that cannot be stopped, whether it's done quietly through disinterest or whether it's done overtly through a critical review. Because in order for analysis to even happen, value judgments need to be made. A system of comparison needs contrast. If Stellar Blade's combat is deep, then what is shallow? If everything is a masterpiece, then what isn't a masterpiece? So as much as people on the True Gaming Reddit may want to claim that traditional critique is outdated, that simply is not possible. If you are recommending that Dark Souls adds an easy mode, this is not a suggestion in a vacuum. It is an indirect critique that the normal gameplay of Dark Souls is too hard. If there is one message I can get across in this video, it's that jumping directly to the proposed solution doesn't erase the unspoken critique. This is why innocently suggesting that your mother, instead of your wife, cook Thanksgiving dinner doesn't tend to go over very well. This is why the conversation around remakes these days is so particularly frustrating, because not only do most remakes cut away at the classic design of their source material, but then veteran fans have to hear about how the new simplified design is an overall improvement. If the controls of Resident Evil 4 Remake are improved, then that means the original over-the-shoulder controls are flawed, right? Again, this is a one-way street. The critique that a game is too hard or unusual is commonly accepted, but the critique that a game is too basic and derivative is taken as pure madness. I have the comment section to prove it. Persistent new player bias is a problem because it punishes legacy skill and stagnates game design as an art form. Whenever devs lecture about game design, they always start from the idea that their game and player exist in a complete vacuum. This is why video essays and lectures always talk about the importance of slowly teaching the player the very basics like moving and jumping over pits and so forth. It's common parlance now that every game should begin with this gentle, childish on-ramp of design and difficulty. Over and over, you will see this idea constantly pushed. Here's the problem though: legacy skill. Games do not exist without context. Most games and genres have already established experts with an arsenal of legacy skill and experience. As I've said before, not every game needs to be for beginners. It is perfectly valid and interesting for a dev to begin his game by breaking this unwritten law and throwing the player into the blender of core difficulty. Sink or swim design is what I like to call it. This is how classic games were often designed, because in the arcade environment, the developer had to account for legacy skill. Pushing expert players to the limits of their legacy skill mattered because otherwise not only would they become bored with the game and move on, and they were important customers, but also because without challenging legacy skill, they'd be able to park on the cabinet all day with no need to expend any more quarters, losing the developer's money. It can be said that in arcade game design, there was a certain degree of expert bias actually, where the more skilled you became at the game, the more gameplay it had to offer, which I find beautiful and artistic. In today's gaming marketplace, this entire structure is inverted. Not only is legacy skill punished in the sense of players not being challenged for large periods of time and expected to take part in mind-numbing passive play, a reality I find particularly punishing, but then on top of that, a lot of games now are too simple to reward skilled players in the long run. Ironically, the more skilled you become as a player, the less content beginner-oriented games can offer you. This is why speedrunning and challenge runs have become so popular. They are a result of players having to create their own competitive metas in order to compensate for the lack of depth in the game design. Dynamic performance metrics like scoring, ranks, leaderboards, and even achievements are really important aspects of design to create depth and longevity, but these days criticizing a game for lacking these elements is viewed as unhinged. Beginners aren't worried about ranks. God knows no one at IGN is thinking about scoring, so their absence no longer matters. In fact, I think most mainstream gamers have seemed to have forgotten that a lot of the mainstream games of the past actually had internal performance systems and ranks. They've just been systematically ignored into extinction. Super Mario Bros. Wonder, the greatest Mario game of all time, right? Removed the final vestige of the arcade legacy of the series, which was the timer. Timers are a dynamic performance metric, and sure, in Mario, Nintendo mostly ignored its potential, but still, the removal of it is significant, even if only in a symbolic sense. The reason why they removed the timer, of course, is so players would not have the burden of difficulty or decision making as they casually stroll through the stages looking for collectibles. This is the new era, and I don't particularly see any force on the horizon that will shift this trend. Players want to be pandered to, developers want to sell games and pander to players, and quote-unquote critics want to be liked. And I can tell you from experience that pushing against this bias towards the lowest common denominator of design is not a pleasant experience. I do think it is an important one though, and hopefully by pointing out this bias I can make a small sector of the gaming world a little more aware of it, hopefully. And so before we all go into the comment section and start beating each other relentlessly, there is one more topic I want to cover in this video, and this is the idea of accessibility, where I don't think anybody on the planet, myself included, is going to be upset over the idea of adding in audio and visual options to help people with impairments. I myself have crappy vision and sometimes need to use these options, especially in shmups. But the reason why I am skeptical over this term is because it is one of those vaguely moralistic terms where if you're able to get what you want labeled under the umbrella of accessibility, then criticizing that idea suddenly seems really ignorant, right? Like, oh, if I don't like the idea of adding in an easy mode to Dark Souls, or even discussing the implications of adding in easy modes to these games, then I have a big problem with people with disabilities or something like that. That's why I don't like these sorts of big umbrella terms like accessibility. But the thing about accessibility when it comes to difficulty is that you're going to run into a very real artistic problem no matter how much you try to shame people who argue against it, which is that difficulty itself is artistic content. The fact that a game is hard and contains design that makes it hard is actual artistic content. Very much so like the reading comprehension of high literature, right? The fact that Ulysses and Anna Karenina and a lot of these great classic works of literature use elevated language and quite difficult to decipher language is a part of their artistic merit. And in other mediums like literature, there is an understanding that that level of inaccessibility is going to be required to achieve that high artistic output. The same holds true with game design. Deep and high-level game design, even if it looks simple on the surface, is going to require a certain amount of difficulty. It's going to require a certain amount of legacy skill and fluency with the medium in order to engage with it. And so the idea that you can take the design of a game like Dark Souls and then just slap on an easy mode is to me the equivalent of reading one of those children's Bibles and thinking it equals somehow the King James Version. Yes, the children's Bible is a good supplemental introductory material to the King James Version one day, but that is not the same gameplay experience, and that is not an experience that is required of the developer on some moralistic level. Sure, in terms of game sales, yes, it does make the game more profitable and more mainstream to add in an easy mode, but I think the fact that Dark Souls has gone so long not adding in a mode like this directly, I mean, you can kind of get an easy mode by just abusing the RPG systems, but in terms of like an actual official easy mode, the fact that it has pushed a large demographic of players to engage with a level of difficulty and a level of game design that they would not have been inclined to do otherwise, I think is really commendable and possibly a big part of its long-term longevity. This is why so many action games and action RPGs now are using the Dark Souls style of design, because Dark Souls, through sheer artistic will, forced a large demographic of players to learn this skill set. And now that they've learned this skill set, turns out they like it, and they like being challenged. And so this is the type of thing that in the short term, you're going to get a lot of pushback from the gaming press and from the beginner bias in terms of really setting your foot down as a developer with difficulty design. But if your game is really good and if it can hang in there past the onslaught of complaints, I do think in the long term, people will respect your game a lot more and it will stick in their minds a lot more because difficulty is artistic content. Difficulty is the fuel of game design. If you don't have difficulty, you are losing some of the RPM, the horsepower of your game design. In my opinion, true accessibility in terms of game design is not just taking away the game design, is not just giving you a children's book instead of giving you Anna Karenina. The difference is true accessible design is giving the player the tools and resources he needs in order to effectively achieve his goals. And you can see this in arcade genres and really good arcade ports like the M2 Shot Triggers ports, where they add in real accessibility options, not only in terms of like bullet visibility, but also in terms of giving you stage select, giving you save states, giving you a practice mode or like practice-like options, giving you the resources you need to access and work through the difficulty in an effective manner. That is true gaming accessibility. In my opinion, yes, if we're pushing for that, that would be a really good thing. I would love to see game critics who are all about accessibility when the new Devil May Cry comes out or the new action game comes out complaining, hey, where's the practice mode? Why isn't the practice mode more robust? Why do I have to unlock the hardest difficulty? Why do I have to play through the campaign 4 different times or all these different times to get to Dante Must Die? I want Dante Must Die right away because I have legacy skill. And that's kind of the funny irony around this discussion of accessibility, because you could make a very credible argument that having legacy skill is also an accessibility concern. Like, why do the legacy skill veteran players have to play through the noob modes? Why do I have to sit through hours of gameplay that is a pure waste of my time? And you all do it. Don't act like you all don't do it. When you are playing Devil May Cry 3 on an emulator, you don't find yourself a nice save file to get right into Dante Must Die mode. So anyway, do not confuse difficulty with accessibility. Difficulty is core content. It is an intrinsic part of the design of the game, of its artistic nature. Accessibility are options and features that help you more effectively engage with the game. And in my opinion, when viewed correctly, accessibility is a really good thing. You just can't take the term, put whatever you want inside it, and start wielding it like a hammer. That's why people don't like that term. It's not because people are against the idea of making games easier to access or making them more efficient to access. It's just people don't like the idea of you using the term to then get whatever you want, even if it doesn't have anything to do with helping people with impairments. And I did promise earlier in the video my explanation of why FPS games are an exception to this bigger trend of beginner-focused design. And the reason for that is actually quite simple. It's because FPS games are the highest legacy skill pool in Western game design. Western gamers are very legitimately skilled at first-person shooters and shooter games in general. So they do not need the difficulty or fundamentals of the core design dumbed down like most other action games. And so ironically, if you want really bold, innovative, interesting design in the West, you're going to often find it in the FPS genre because the FPS genre has the most skill-literate fan base. My brothers, for example, are what you would consider casual gamers. So if I handed them Devil May Cry or I handed them Ninja Gaiden 2, they would really struggle with these games and probably become frustrated and put them down very quickly. But you put an FPS in their hand, you get them into a match of Call of Duty, and they are ruthless killers. They are like significantly much better than I am at FPS, and my younger brother used to just dominate online matches just every single time for years. So that is a good example of the skill set of shooter players in the West, where even casual shooter players in the American fan base are like amazingly good. And so this is why if you want interesting, bold, difficult design in Western gaming, and now Japanese games are becoming more westernized, you will find it mostly in FPS and shooters. And unfortunately, you do not find it as much anymore in traditional action games, which I think is a huge shame. And if you enjoyed this review, please check out this new video essay playlist I have here on the channel. I think it is a cool new inclusion. And of course, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. I plan on going full-time this year in September, so any additional Patreon support is very much appreciated right now. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Anhold, AJA, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Owleye, Autonamed, Beelit, Beam Pit, Bo, Beetle Dames, Boghog, Board Basmati, Borgie22, Chase Palumbo, Chris Yusufovich, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Clara Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Colorboy, Cooksan666, Cook Some Soup, Des Audio, Dances with Incels, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Dick Jones, Dingo, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Elias Alonso, Eric Houdini, Fabra, FCK, F Deluxe, Friskin, Florida Sucks, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Full Set, Game Boy Guru, Geese Machine, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hausu, Hero Death, Kiki Hime, HUD, Jake Ryan, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JBRPG, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, Josh Mayer, K, K2, Contain, Craze the Boys, Mieshma, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mars Bar, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Meister, Mewgem, Milo Shamel, Misha, Munro, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Dagger Games, Nila Agitis, Okla Kugels, Ospe, Pedro Perez, Poorly Written Protagonist, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Ralph Tuhilo, Raul, Rapido, Real Skeen, Ren Halt's Time, Retro Schmupper, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Ryan Bartlett, Scanline City, Segfault, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Sirapong, Sky2K, Spiders STG, Steady AI, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Temzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Toho Rosardi, Travis Arbon, Sugumo, 2IU, Twilight EX, Unikoi Roots, Ursua, Ushi Mushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Wabby Legs, What Is This, Zachary Patton, and Zeal.
Done.